is Link within Breath of the Wild, a hero we have seen before. Many years have passed since the release of another Zelda title, Ocarina of Time. In it, the hero of time courageously defends Hyrule from an impending calamity. Notwithstanding, these two heroes share a commonality, one that has foreshadowed events leading up to Breath of the Wild.
From the events of Breath of the Wild, Link the Champion of Hyrule is already an established hero. With him donning the Champion's shirt and wielding the Master Sword, he is indeed a force to be reckoned with.
Within the events of the latest Zelda, we know that this same hero went through some sort of a calamity, the rise of Ganon, and unusually around this time, Guardians of the Sheikah, these massive battle tanks, stormed Hyrule Castle and ultimately laid waste to the city. Running away from the destruction of Hyrule, Link fell due to grievous wounds. Presumably, Zelda saved the hero from total destruction from the Guardians. However, the Master Sword became damaged, and the kingdom would soon dissolve. To address these issues, the princess allegedly had a part in placing Link's body in the Resurrection Chamber, along with safeguarding the Master Sword near the Deku Tree. So, what happened? How could events spiral to this point? Now, this is where we discuss the timeline placement for Breath of the Wild. However, before we discuss where the game takes place in the timeline, let's see where the game cannot take place in.
The sources backing up our statements include Hyrule Historia and in-game text from various Zelda games.
Now, when discussing the timeline in context to Breath of the Wild, let's see what kind of entities are around in the game. So let's start simple. We know for a fact that the Kingdom of Hyrule as a governing body is around in Breath of the Wild. Within Hyrule Historia's timeline, it states that the first establishment of the Kingdom of Hyrule began during the era of prosperity. So with that information, we know that Breath of the Wild at the very least has to take place after the era of prosperity.
With the same source, Hyrule Historia page 77, we know that the Temple of Time was constructed by Rauru after the events of the Era of Chaos. Since we do see the Temple of Time within Breath of the Wild, we can make another notion that the game takes place at least after this time.
So now that we have that out of the way, granted it doesn't really narrow down much, but at the very least we are making some progress. Since we are on the unified timeline, let's take another look at Hyrule Historia, specifically around the events leading up to Minish Cap. Around page 78, the book states, "In the first major event to happen since the Kingdom of Hyrule was established, the world was engulfed by evil beings and shrouded in darkness. It was then a tiny Picori descended from the sky, bringing a golden light and a sword."
In other words, according to Hyrule Historia, the first major event since the founding of the kingdom is the War of the Bound Chest. With this information in mind, it is not likely that Breath of the Wild takes place during this time period, as the War of the Bound Chest deals with another situation entirely. Moving on to another potential timeline placement, for the sake of fairness, let's see a potential placement of Breath of the Wild in between Minish Cap and Four Swords. With Hyrule Historia in mind, however, Breath of the Wild cannot take place anywhere before the events of Ocarina of Time. The reason for that is this.
According to Hyrule Historia page 90, the name Ganon is a nickname for Ganondorf, the person. In short, Ganon's first appearance within the entirety of the Zelda timeline is in Ocarina of Time, meaning that he wasn't around prior to these events. And since Ganon is definitely around in Breath of the Wild, we can zero down a timeline placement that takes place at least after Ocarina of Time. But before we jump the gun, let's talk about the events leading up to Ocarina. To this end, let's talk about the Hyrulean Civil War. Now, granted, we don't really have much information to go on for this event, but what we do know is that as a result of the war, the entirety of Hyrule was united under the banner of the Hylian royal family. We also know that the war took place at least 8 years before Ocarina of Time, since Link was born during the war and Shigeru Miyamoto confirmed Link's age in an interview.
Moving on. One of the consequences of the conflict revolved around a young mother along with her child, who escaped the fires of war. This mother ultimately gave her child to the Deku Tree for him to raise. This child eventually became the hero of time. Talking of the Civil War, the conflict seemed to have included the Sheikah. For example, take a look at this quote from Shikashi.
"Have you ever heard of the Shadow Folk? They are the Sheikah, the shadows of the Hylians. They say they swore allegiance to the King of Hyrule, and guarded the royal family. But with the long peace, no one has seen a Sheikah around here for a long time.
Now, it is implied that due to the Hyrulean Civil War, that the Sheikah were nearly exterminated and or disappeared. For further proof, let's take a look at both the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple. In the bottom of the well, it is known that the man who can see the truth was sealed down there. This man is also implied to be both a Sheikah and Bongo Bongo. Here is another quote from Shikashi.
A long time ago, there was a man in this very village who had an eye they said could see the truth. Now, usually you have to train your mind's eye most strenuously to actually see the truth. But this fella, no. They say he had a different way of doing things. His house stood where the well is now. In other words, not only did this mysterious man, known as the man who can see the truth, live in Kakariko, he was also killed, presumably in a horrific fashion. Additionally, it is also confirmed by in-game lore that Kakariko used to be a Sheikah village. Now, it is implied that this former settlement was actually destroyed during the Civil War. The Kakariko village that replaced it is in fact just being built, which is why the carpenters are building houses during the beginning of the game.
But moving on, things become even more grim for the Sheikah when it comes to the Shadow Temple. We know for a fact that this temple is related to the Sheikah, not only for the front gate having one huge Sheikah symbol, but also due to the notion that Impa is the sage of the temple, which leads us to this dark quote.
Shadow Temple. Here lays Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred. This statement can mean many things, but some speculate it actually refers to the Civil War, where the Sheikah were systematically wiped out or driven out of Hyrule during this event. As a result of the war, the Sheikah village turned into Kakariko, and for all we know when Ocarina came out, that Impa is the last of her tribe. Now, I do not think Breath of the Wild takes place during the Civil War. For one, Calamity Ganon is a big element within the game, and the man Ganondorf didn't make his moves until the events of Ocarina, not before, which is why Ganondorf was actually invited to the King of Hyrule's throne room. Additionally, the game features 2 Hyrule Castle towns, something that Ocarina of Time did not have.
However, what we do know is that because of the Hyrulean Civil War, that there may have been some Sheikah resentment towards the Hylians. Think about it, their home was destroyed and took over by the Hylians, and who knows what actually happened within the Shadow Temple.
In short, we have already seen a possible Sheikah rebellion during the Civil War. So that leaves the question, what exactly happened to the Sheikah? Were they all killed off, or did they disappear somewhere? And this leads us to a portion of the new Breath of the Wild trailer, where we hear an elderly woman talk. Some speculate this could be Impa, which may or may not be the case, but what she said bears mentioning. The history of the royal family of Hyrule is also the history of the Calamity Ganon, a primal evil that has endured over the ages.
Now, according to this statement, Ganon has been around for quite some time. When this individual says that the history of the royal family is tied to Ganon, references to Demise in Skyward Sword are made, where he cursed the future incarnations of Zelda to eternal struggle. And considering the statement, whoever said this sees Ganon as being around for a substantial period of time. In other words, according to this information, Breath of the Wild should take place sometime after Ocarina. So all that leaves us is 3 other timelines within the split. So let's analyze each one step by step.
First, talking about the Downfall timeline, let's look at the Imprisoning War. In this event, when the Link from Ocarina of Time faced Ganondorf during the final battle, he actually lost and died, thus leading the way for Ganondorf claiming the entire Triforce, but was then eventually sealed by Zelda and the Sages. Admittedly, this scenario sounds very similar to what occurs in Breath of the Wild, but there are differences. The reason why I say that is according to Hyrule Historia page 90, Link dies during the final boss fight with Ganondorf within Ocarina of Time. But within the trailers of Breath of the Wild that we have already seen, it appears that an entirely different situation occurs. Moreover, in Breath trailers, we see a pristine Hyrule castle, almost as if the Kingdom of Hyrule enjoyed a period of peace prior to the calamity, whereas in the final battle between Link and Ganondorf in Ocarina took place in Ganon's Tower, surrounding the ruins of the old Hyrule Castle. I suppose an argument can be made with the 2 Hyrule Castle towns in mind, but that still includes Link dying at the hands of Ganondorf during the final battle at the tower, as confirmed by Hyrule Historia. In other words, both events have differences. And looking more at the Downfall timeline, I do not think Breath of the Wild will take place in it. After the Imprisoning War, we see the games that revolve around A Link to the Past, which includes the Oracle games, Link's Awakening, A Link Between Worlds, and Triforce Heroes. I suppose there could be a placement before or after Zelda 1 and 2, but there still would be conflicts with this. Within most of the Dawnfall timeline in Hyrule, the Zora tribe have become the Green Zora variant, whereas in Breath of the Wild, we definitely see the Blue Zora variant. Now with that out of the way, let's move on to the adult timeline.
First, let's look at the Great Flood. During this time, Ganondorf managed to break his seal, with no Link to stop him. The goddess decided to flood Hyrule. As a result of these events, I do not think Breath of the Wild takes place during this particular section of the timeline. After Wind Waker is a bit tricky.
According to new information about Breath of the Wild, it has been revealed that these birdmen are in fact the Rito. To bring a brief backstory, the Rito are an evolution of the Zora. What is interesting about the Rito within Wind Waker is that no Rito is born with wings. Rather, they gain wings by visiting the Spirit Velu. Indeed, many were perplexed with the notion that both the Rito and the Zora exist at roughly a similar time period. So, how do we explain this? Now, honestly, we could do a whole video about evolution in the Zora, which can definitely run for quite some time. So, to be brief, when looking at the Zora as a species, they seem to be extremely susceptible to changes in climate. For example, the Blue Zora can survive in both fresh and salt water, but display difficulty in living in murky water with abnormal temperatures, whereas the Green Zora display the ability to live in more harsher climates. For example, when the Imprisoning War occurred, there seems to have been a split in Zora migration, with one breed of Zora staying in Hyrule during the war, eventually becoming the Green Zora presumably due to the conflict, whereas another breed of Zora left Hyrule entirely to live on the island of Labrina. This breed of Zora remained the blue variant, whereas their genetic cousins became the Green Zora in Hyrule. So how does that relate to the situation between the Rito and Zora within Breath of the Wild? Well, the case may have been similar, that a portion of Zora lived in an environment analogous to pre-Wind Waker times. Then eventually both breeds met. So far, the adult timeline under this context seems fairly viable for Breath of the Wild to take place in. The biggest argument I see for a placement after Wind Waker is the inclusion of both the Koroks and the Deku Tree, where the Koroks successfully unflood Hyrule. However, we do know that Koroks are not necessarily exclusive to the adult timeline, as the Deku Tree explains that the Koroks are just a natural form of the Kokiri, meaning we can see similar results across different timelines. An example of this lays within A Link Between Worlds, where we do see a cameo of the same creatures. Additionally, later down in the adult timeline, a brand new Kingdom of Hyrule was created in a separate land altogether. I suppose another argument can be made that over hundreds and hundreds of years, that this new Kingdom of Hyrule from Spirit Tracks retook the old Hyrule, at which case the inclusion of both the Rito and the Zora being around at the same time can make sense. However, loads of questions arise. During the events of Wind Waker, it is more or less implied that the Zora race went extinct, and basically the Rito tribe is the only remnant of the Zora around. Well, technically we do see Zora after Wind Waker within Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, but this variant of Zora is completely different from either Blue or Green Zora. Additionally, on that note, where do the Sheikah fit into this equation? While I won't outright throw away the possibility of a placement in the adult timeline, I do see it as unlikely due to some quotes from Eiji Aonuma which we will get into. But for now, I will consider a placement here as a possibility.
Now let's take a look at the child timeline. In this time frame between the events of Ocarina of Time to Twilight Princess, there existed a period where Link came back in time to warn the royal family of Ganondorf's intent to conquer Hyrule. This is what Hyrule Historia page 113 had to say about it.
In Hyrule, Princess Zelda was informed of what would happen in the future by Link, the hero of time. She realized that leaving Ganondorf to his own devices would cause the downfall of her kingdom. Many years later, Ganondorf, the infamous demon thief who wielded the power of magic, was finally to be executed.
In other words, a conflict occurred in between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess that eventually saw the failed execution of Ganondorf. Many Zelda theorists have labelled this conflict as the Gerudo-Hylian War, including us in the Link's Darkest Secret theory. Similar to Civil War, it saw the near extermination of a particular tribe, in this case the Gerudo. Within Arbiter's grounds you can see statues of Hylian soldiers, and within the Star-Lord boss fight you can see soldiers who wear garbs, similar to the same troops. In fact, the Arbiter's Grounds appears to be a Gerudo place of worship that was turned into a torture prison, very similar to the Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time.
So, in between these events, the Hero of Time travels to Termina, where the events of Majora's Mask begin. At some point, he does return, as indicated by the Hero's Bow, which does state that it used to belong to the former hero. Additionally, it is also stated by Hyrule Historia page 118 that the Hero Shade in Twilight Princess is the Hero of Time. Nearing the events of Twilight Princess, however, Ganondorf was subdued and was sentenced to be killed by the sages. However, the execution failed and he was exiled to the Twilight Realm. Speaking of which, an interesting phrase found in Hyrule Historia is noted which states, Ganondorf and his malice, sent to the Twilight Realm, plunged the shadowy domain into madness. This quote is followed up with another mention of Ganondorf's malice, and according to the first quote, what exactly is this malice? Well, thanks to a very recent news coverage coming from Game Informer's latest magazine, a substance known as malice covers dungeons and shrines alike, which we already have seen in previous trailers. And since this malice substance appears similar to Ganon's aura, they are likely connected. In addition, due to this, we can make a connection with Ganon's malice within Twilight Princess. Now we will get to the significance to this later down in this video. But moving on, during the events of Twilight Princess, a notable event is mentioned, the Interloper War, where it is speculated that it occurred all the way back during the Era of Chaos. The reason why I did not mention it before is that it is not confirmed on any official source that the Interloper War took place during the Era of Chaos. In fact, it is not really stated where exactly the Interloper War takes place in. We also know that Midna, the Princess of the Twilight, is related to the Interlopers, along with the rest of the Kingdom of Twilight. Additionally, we can also make the assessment that the Twilight are in fact descended from the Sheikah, as the symbol appears right above the throne within the Palace of Twilight, in addition with another symbol being right behind the Fused Shadow.
Speaking of which, the entirety of Twilight Princess just gives a host of different questions. Where did the Okar come from? What about the City in the Sky, the Hero's Shade, Snow Peak Mansion, the Temple of Time? Is the Deku Tree dead in this game? What the heck happened in Arbiter's Grounds, etc, etc. And this is where we lead to an interview with Eiji Aonuma regarding Twilight Princess HD. Aonuma did say that there would be a connection between Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild. Perhaps that could include some story connections.
An example of this lays within several references of Breath of the Wild found in TPHD. The most notable one are these tablets, which displays the Rito, which may or may not reference Rebal within Breath of the Wild. The same tablet features a Goron, which may or may not reference Dark Hell. And at the same time, the tablet displays a Zora wielding a spear, awfully similar to the Zora girl Rifa, who also wields a spear-like trident. The point is, we see three different races, which basically mirrors these three companions within Breath of the Wild. Now, is this coincidence? Additionally, the woman in the middle is in fact wearing a garb very similar to the Hylia outfit that Zelda is wearing. Now, we don't really know currently who are the other individuals, but we do see a young Link in each depiction. But talking about the timeline placement again, since Eiji Aonuma did say that there would be a connection between both Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, I do see it likely that Breath of the Wild can take place sometime around Twilight Princess. It could answer what happened to the Deku Tree in this timeline. It would make sense chronologically as there are two castle towns in TPHD, and could give us some insight to what happened during the Interloper War, where we still don't know where it officially takes place in the timeline.
But to be devil's advocate, let's point out some flaws around this timeline placement. The biggest one is the geography. Thanks to Wasaravio, sorry if I butchered the name, comparing the map of Breath of the Wild to Twilight Princess, and I must say, they really don't match up. However, the maps can match up if some editing is involved, but then again, geography and Zelda don't really mix all that well. But moving on to Four Swords Adventures, can we see a timeline placement around this game? Well, according to Hyrule Historia at least, Breath of the Wild can't take place in between Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures. At the end of Twilight Princess, this is what the book had to say.
Link returned the Master Sword to the forest and went back to Ordon Village. The world received the blessings of the gods once more, and the land was covered in light.
And this quote is followed up by another quote leading up to Four Swords Adventures, which states,
Several hundred years after Ganondorf's defeat, relations between Gerudo Village and Hyrule had become friendly once more. and peace had been restored to the land.
In other words, between Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures, according to Hyrule Historia, there is a period of peace between both games. So okay, what about placement after Four Swords Adventures? Well, it is a little bit ambiguous. Ganondorf is killed off yet again along with Vati. What happens after that is really up in the air. I mean, Breath of the Wild possibly could take place after Four Swords Adventures, but that just strikes me as plain out odd, for reasons we will get into in a bit.
So where does that leave us in terms of a Breath of the Wild timeline placement? Well, according to our logic, regarding Twilight Princess and its connection with Breath of the Wild, I do think there is a strong possibility of a placement after Ocarina of Time within the Child timeline, a Twilight Princess prequel in short. Thanks to a good friend of mine, Zeltic, he along with his buddies managed to decode the Master Edition tapestry of Breath of the Wild. In short, this is what it says regarding the backstory of the game.
Hylians pass stories of a destined time long past, where multiple races lived and worked together in harmony. The Sheikah's tribe Blue Aura breathed through the land, and this mutual prosperity continued, until a cataclysmic disaster struck. The hero and the princess attempted in vain to seal the terror, which became known as the Calamity Ganon. Divine beasts awoke from 4 directions, and deployed a mechanical army, which made the king and his people fearful. They fractured Ganon's power and sealed him, but the Sheikah were banished from the land ever since. Now, do these events sound familiar? Within Twilight Princess, the Interloper War is also described to be intervened by 4 divine beasts as well. However, this time it deals with the light spirits. Do these two share parallels? Maybe, maybe not. I can also see parallels to the 4 giants within Majora's Mask.
But where did all the Sheikah tech come from? Well, according to what we know so far, all the Sheikah tech was hidden underground for potentially thousands of years, meaning that it just appeared as a defense mechanism against a threat. This threat, at which case, is Calamity Ganon. As stated by the tapestry, the divine beasts, meaning the giant mechanized creations, were deployed to seal away Ganon. And if this event alludes to what happens to the trailer, it makes sense, as Calamity Ganon was sealed away in the castle by these 4 pillars. But something happens. These mechanized beasts went corrupt and went on a rampage against the rest of Hyrule. Some say they are corrupted due to Calamity Ganon, but I am not so sure. Remember, Calamity Ganon is still sealed away due to these 4 pillars. If Ganon somehow took control of these guardians, then why would he still be sealed away? Now, this is where we enter a Sheikah rebellion. During the recent Nintendo Switch trailer, we see an individual wearing an upside-down Sheikah mask, and the same man was fighting Link. Moreover, in another trailer, we see an individual wearing a similar outfit right behind Link and Zelda, almost as if the duo is protecting this individual. So what does that mean? Is this person a rebel Sheikah? And if so, why is he fighting against Link? Well, remember what we just described about in the Civil War, how the Sheikah were either killed off and or driven away from Hyrule? During the events of the Civil War before Ocarina, we may have seen a faction of Sheikah leave Hyrule entirely because of the conflict, which would follow what Kakashi stated how the Sheikah seemingly disappeared.
Around the time during the events after Ocarina of Time, the same group of rebel Sheikah may have returned to enact some sort of revenge, and with their return managed to hijack ancient technology utilised by their distant ancestors, which would explain why the Guardians turned a different colour. And it also explains why the calamity occurred inside Hyrule Castle rather than outside. Think about it. If Ganon invaded Hyrule Castle, obviously the Kingdom of Hyrule would put up some kind of defence, meaning the attack will come from outside the castle. But here we are seeing an explosion coming from inside the castle. There is a possibility that these rebel Sheikah played a role in this.
And this can also explain why the Master Sword became damaged. In a previous theory, I explained how the Master Sword repels evil, meaning that the blade should do more harm against Ganon rather than the other way around. But if the rebel Sheikah are in play, this can change things up. Remember that the Sheikah are the attendants of the goddess Hylia, which could account for them learning some way in how to damage the blade. Additionally, around the end of the trailer, we see both Link and Zelda run away in a forest. Mysteriously, we don't see who they are running away from. We know it is not Calamity Ganon as he is sealed away in the castle. So who are they running away from? Is it a guardian like what we have seen previously? My personal view is that it is not a guardian chasing Link and Zelda within this particular scene. Remember, guardians attack from long range using their beam, as shown off previously.
But in this snippet, it looks as if they were running away from something else. Could they be running away from a rebel Sheikah? Not sure, but it is probably something plot significant. Additionally, this Sheikah rebellion can shed some light on the Interloper War. Since we don't officially know when this event took place, all we know is that it takes place before Twilight Princess. Could Breath of the Wild be a retelling of the Interloper conflict? Perhaps, perhaps not. Additionally, another parallel between the Interlopers and the Sheikah can be found within Breath of the Wild, within the tapestry more specifically, which states,
"The Sheikah tribe's blue aura breathed through the land." Now, what other kind of tech also shines blue? Twilight tech. As stated previously, the Twilight are descended from the Sheikah. So, to add more detail, when the Twilight tech turns aggressive, instead of blue, a red aura appears, which also makes another similarity to the corrupted Guardians. To add another point of reference, we actually have seen another moment of this corruption effect found in Breath of the Wild. Within Twilight Princess, when Zant uses a sword to stab at the head of Star-Lord, a kind of similar corrupting effect occurs, which causes Star-Lord to come to life. In short, I do think that these rebel Sheikah within Breath of the Wild, these interlopers, and the Twilight are indeed related in some way.
And lastly, we do see a Zelda in a white dress and bracelets, similar to the Hylia garb in Skyward Sword. Additionally, we do see many Hylia statues, along with references to her. This can go along with this Sheikah connection, that Zelda was dressing up as Hylia for a reason. Remember that the Sheikah originally served Hylia, meaning that if Zelda dressed up as Hylia, she was trying to perceive herself as the legitimate ruler of the Sheikah. Which brings this quote into context.
"Everything I have done up until now, it was all for nothing." That Zelda failed in her task in uniting the two warring Sheikah. As a result of this, Hyrule descended into decay. So what does this mean? For a timeline placement, I think Breath of the Wild takes place before Twilight Princess. Adding on to that, I think that there is a possibility that this link found in Breath of the Wild is the same link found in Ocarina of Time. The reason why I say that is this. After the events of Ocarina of Time, when Link came back in time to warn the royal family about Ganondorf, he was no longer considered the hero of Hyrule, as the events within Ocarina never happened within the child timeline. Coupled with that, along with the fact that the hero within Breath of the Wild has the Master Sword, which can explain why this Link has the champion shirt, which states that only those close to the royal family owns it. More evidence with this goes back to when Link wakes up, where Zelda does bring up the fact that Link has saved Hyrule before.
To add more evidence to this connection, at the end of the Breath of the Wild trailer, we do see Zelda near the Great Deku Tree. Now, why did Zelda even know the Deku Tree even exists? According to Hyrule Historia, page 84, the forest surrounding the Deku Tree is named the Forbidden Forest, meaning outsiders rarely ever enter this area. So how does Zelda know about this location? Through Link. If this Link is the hero of time, he knows the Deku Tree well, as he was raised under him.
Also notice the quote, "That look on your face tells me that you have no recollection of me, however. I think you are now ready to hear what happened 100 years ago." Presumably this quote came from the Deku Tree, and notice the terms, "no recollection of me," meaning that these two know each other prior to the events of the game. But to be devil's advocate once more, there is a difference of hand orientation between both heroes. Within Breath of the Wild, we see a Link that is right-handed, whereas in Ocarina of Time, the hero of time is left-handed. An answer to this can lay within a recent trailer, where we see Link's left hand to be severely injured, which can possibly explain the different hand orientation. But more questions remain. If Breath of the Wild takes place between Ocarina of Time to Twilight Princess, and if this Link is the hero of time, will we see the transformation of Link turning into the hero Shade? And if so, will he lose an eye in the game, or will we see another death of the Great Deku Tree? On a final note, the shield design of the hero Shade in Twilight Princess is very similar to the Traveler shield we see for Link in Breath of the Wild. Are these related? Not completely sure.
But to be devil's advocate once more, there are flaws to this theory, which mainly rests on both Ganondorf and the Gerudo. In between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, we know that Ganondorf eventually gets exiled to the Twilight Realm, whereas in Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon seems to be an entirely different beast altogether. Additionally, within Twilight Princess, the Gerudo have all been driven out of Hyrule, whereas in Breath of the Wild we do actually see Gerudo villages.
So how will these plot points be connected, or even at all? Again, I am not sure. The main reason why we subscribe to this theory, however, comes from the words of Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma himself, where he states, "When I look at this remake, I feel like this is the origin point of the new title we're making right now. After playing, you may have some 'oh, I see' moments when playing the new game, so I'll be glad if you play Twilight Princess HD while waiting in anticipation for the latest title of Legend of Zelda." In other words, under a developer's perspective, there is a connection between Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess, a connection that undoubtedly will be shown when the game finally comes out on March 3rd. Heck, we already found a connection with Ganon's malice found in both Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild. Is this simply a coincidence?
But what do you guys think? Is there a connection between Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild? And if so, how do you think it will come about? Hopefully this video sparks some discussion in the comments.
And wow, this is probably the longest Zelda theory I've ever done, and special thanks goes to Luke Crane and Gator Time for helping me put together a 14-page video. Really, I appreciate it, guys. But speaking about Breath of the Wild, undoubtedly more Zelda theories will come once the game finally does come out. This theory in particular is meant to look at things more logically using available sources as a foundation. So in that sense, I hope you guys enjoyed it. But hey, it's just a theory, a Zelda theory, okay, I promise I would never do that again. But after voicing for 14 pages and coming out of a fever, my mind just kind of caved in, I suppose. But if you guys are watching for this long, I wanted to make a brief update on this channel. In the near future, this channel will be going under a few changes. The Zelda theories will always remain on the channel, but I will also be adding a new series that can complement theories. I won't say much of it now, but we did put together something of a trailer that we will show off. So without further ado, please like, comment, and subscribe if you're new. Till then, enjoy this new series we are working on.